What if the past was never as silent as we imagined? Across the world, in deserts, forests, islands, and river valleys, certain ancient structures seem to stand apart from ordinary history. They are not merely large. They are precise. They are aligned with stars, shaped by geometry, carved from stones that seem too heavy for their age, and placed in landscapes that feel chosen with almost mathematical care. For centuries, we have called many of them tombs, temples, calendars, or ceremonial centers. And in many cases, those explanations may be partly true. Human beings have always built for the dead, for the gods, for the seasons, and for memory. But sometimes, a structure seems to ask for another kind of attention. Some researchers have suggested that these places were not isolated monuments, but parts of a much larger pattern. A prehistoric network, perhaps symbolic, perhaps energetic, perhaps simply cultural, stretched across the surface of the Earth. This idea is often called the world grid theory, the possibility that certain ancient sites were positioned to interact with natural forces, magnetic fields, acoustic resonance, water, stone, and vibration. The evidence remains incomplete. The questions remain fragile. But the mystery is difficult to ignore. From the Great Pyramid to Stonehenge, from Teotihuacan to the polished chambers of India, we are about to follow a trail of geometry, sound, and stone. And at the end of that trail waits a place some have linked to strange effects in perception, resonance, and even localized anomalies in gravity. If these structures were only monuments, they are extraordinary. But if they were something more, then perhaps ancient architecture was never just about building upward. Perhaps it was about listening downward, into the earth itself. The first structure rises from the Egyptian plateau like a shape remembered from a dream. The Great Pyramid of Giza has been measured, photographed, entered, mapped, and debated more than almost any monument on Earth. It has been called a royal tomb, an astronomical marker, a sacred mountain, and a masterpiece of state power. Yet for all we know about its dimensions, we still do not fully understand why it was built with such exactness. The so-called Giza Power Plant theory is one possible interpretation, not accepted by mainstream archaeology, but persistent because it tries to explain the pyramid as a functional machine. In this view, the chambers, shafts, and materials were not only symbolic. They may have played a role in concentrating vibration, pressure, or electrical effects generated through stone, water, and earth energy. The theory often points to the materials themselves. The limestone casing, the dolomite-rich stone, and the granite beams in the king's chamber have been discussed for their conductive or piezoelectric qualities. Granite contains quartz, and quartz can produce tiny electrical charges when placed under mechanical stress. In modern science, that principle is real. Whether the pyramid used it intentionally is another matter. Still, the thought lingers. Ancient builders selected and moved materials with astonishing effort. They created narrow passages, resonant chambers, and geometric relationships that continue to provoke calculation. Even if the pyramid was not a power plant in the literal sense, it may have been designed around forces modern visitors rarely feel: weight, pressure, echo, darkness, and the invisible mathematics of stone. Standing before it, one senses that the pyramid does not explain itself. It waits, with the patience of 4,000 years, for each age to ask better questions. South of Giza, in the sacred landscape of Abydos, another structure lies half-buried in mystery and water memory. The Osirian does not feel like a typical temple. It feels older, heavier, more withdrawn. Massive granite blocks, some estimated at extraordinary weights, form a sunken chamber that seems less like a building than the exposed skeleton of an ancient machine. The stone is austere. The geometry is severe. The silence inside it feels deliberate. Its association with Osiris gives the site deep mythological power. Osiris was the god of death, rebirth, hidden knowledge, and the fertile underworld. To walk into the Osirian is to descend into a symbolic landscape where stone, water, and resurrection meet. But beyond mythology, there is the question of engineering. How were such heavy stones transported and placed with such precision? Traditional explanations rely on ramps, ropes, labor organization, and generations of practical skill. These explanations are powerful and often underestimated. Ancient people did not need modern machines to be brilliant, but the Osirian still leaves room for awe. On one of its stones appears a pattern known today as the Flower of Life, a series of overlapping circles that many later traditions have interpreted as a symbol of creation and geometric order. Its exact age and meaning at this site remain debated. Yet visually it suggests something important. That geometry was not decoration alone. It was a language. Whether the Osirian was a tomb, temple, symbolic underworld, or resonant chamber, it speaks in circles, weight, and water. It reminds us that ancient knowledge may not always have been written in words. Sometimes it was carved into proportion. Far across the ocean, in the high valley of Mexico, a city of avenues and pyramids seems to have been laid out like a diagram on the earth. Teotihuacan was already ancient when the Aztecs found it. They called it the place where the gods were made. Its original builders remain uncertain, their language mostly lost, their intentions preserved only in walls, murals, alignments, and the vast avenue of the dead stretching through the city like a stone meridian. What makes Teotihuacan especially strange is not only its scale, but its hidden material story. In some structures, researchers have identified sheets and layers of mica, a mineral valued today for its ability to resist heat and insulate electricity. Mica appears in modern electronics, aerospace components, and industrial systems. The ancient presence of it beneath floors and within temple complexes has encouraged speculation about whether the builders understood its unusual properties. Care is needed here. The use of mica does not prove advanced technology. It may have held ritual value, visual beauty, symbolic meaning, or practical function we have not yet reconstructed. But its placement invites a deeper question. Why would a society transport and install such a specialized mineral if it were meaningless? Teotihuacan's pyramids also align with celestial and landscape patterns. The city seems to have been planned with a sense of cosmic order, as if urban life itself could be arranged according to the movements of the heavens and the hidden rhythms of the land. Perhaps that is what ancient geometry often meant. Not cold mathematics, but relationship. Between sky and earth, between city and body, between stone, ritual, and time. Teotihuacan does not tell us it was a machine. It tells us that for its builders, the world itself may have been one. There are places where architecture does not merely surround the human voice. It changes it. Beneath the island of Malta lies the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, a subterranean complex carved into limestone thousands of years ago. Its chambers descend through levels of ritual space, burial, darkness, and echo. Entering it is not like walking into a building. It is more like entering the memory of the earth through a wound in the stone. The most famous space is often called the oracle chamber. In this room, a low male voice can create a powerful resonance, often described around 110 hertz. Some studies have explored how exposure to certain low frequencies may influence brain activity, mood, or meditative states. The connection is still being examined carefully, but the effect inside the chamber is real enough to leave a lasting impression. The voice seems to multiply. It rolls through the stone, wraps around the body, and returns as something larger than speech. The listener is not only hearing sound, the listener is being touched by it. This is where ancient architecture becomes intimate. It suggests that builders may have designed sacred spaces not only for sight, but for vibration. In the modern world, we often treat buildings as visual objects. We ask how they look. But the Hypogeum asks how a place feels in the chest, in the bones, in the quiet chambers of attention. Maybe sound was once considered a bridge between worlds. Not magic in the theatrical sense, but a serious human technology of emotion, memory, and altered perception. In Malta, the stone does not speak. It teaches the voice how to return. In Florida, beside ordinary roads and modern neighborhoods, stands a monument that feels displaced from time. Coral Castle was built in the 20th century by a Latvian immigrant named Edward Līdzkalnis. Working mostly alone, he carved, moved, and arranged large blocks of oolitic limestone into walls, gates, chairs, towers, and strange astronomical forms. Some stones weigh many tons. One famous gate once moved with remarkable ease despite its enormous mass. Līdzkalnis was a small man, private and eccentric. He claimed in his own way that he understood the secrets used to build the pyramids. That statement has fascinated generations. Was he speaking metaphorically, mechanically, spiritually, or simply protecting his methods from curiosity? The most grounded explanation is that Līdzkalnis used clever engineering. Tripods, pulleys, counterweights, leverage, patience, and a deep practical understanding of balance. Human ingenuity can appear mysterious when it is practiced in solitude. Yet the emotional power of Coral Castle comes from the gap between what we see and what we imagine. Here was one man, under the night sky, raising stone as though answering a private grief. The site is often linked to a lost love story, though details have blurred over time. Whatever its origin, Coral Castle reminds us that ancient mysteries are not only ancient. They can appear whenever technique, silence, and obsession meet. It also forces us to reconsider the past with humility. If one determined person could create such a place with simple tools, then ancient societies with generations of skilled labor may have achieved far more than we assume. Still, Līdzkalnis' claim remains like a note left in the dust. What did he think the pyramid builders knew? On the Salisbury Plain, Stonehenge does not rise like a mountain. It gathers like a thought. The stones stand in a circle that has survived weather, empire, excavation, and imagination. For centuries, people have tried to explain it as a calendar, a temple, a burial site, a healing place, an astronomical instrument, or a monument to ancestral power. Each explanation has merit. None feels complete. Recent acoustic research has suggested that Stonehenge, when reconstructed in its fuller ancient form, may have shaped sound in unusual ways. The arrangement of stones could have reflected and contained voices, drums, or ritual noise, creating an intimate acoustic environment inside the circle. To those standing within it, sound may have become focused, enclosed, and transformed. Some stones from the broader Stonehenge landscape have also been described as having ringing qualities when struck, especially certain blue stones transported from Wales. Whether this sonic property was one reason they were chosen is still uncertain, but the possibility is quietly profound. Imagine an ancient gathering at dusk, the sky lowering, the stones dark against the last light. A voice begins. Then another. A drum sounds and the circle answers. For modern minds, geometry is often abstract. For ancient communities, it may have been experiential. A circle was not merely a shape. It was a container for people, sound, sky, and memory. Stonehenge may have organized more than the calendar. It may have organized attention. If the Hypogeum turned the human voice inward, Stonehenge may have projected it outward, into ritual space and open air. The mystery is not whether ancient people understood sound, it is how much they valued listening. In the Pacific, on the island of Pohnpei, a ruined city rises from water like the remains of a dream built in basalt. Nan Madol is unlike almost any other ancient site. Its platforms, walls, canals, and enclosures were constructed on a coral reef, forming an artificial city spread across small islets. Huge basalt columns, dark and heavy, were stacked like logs in walls that seem both practical and ceremonial. The result is haunting. A stone city between land and sea, suspended in tidal silence. Local traditions give Nan Madol deep spiritual significance. Archaeology connects it to the Saudeleur dynasty, political power, ritual authority, and the organization of labor on Pohnpei. Yet the site's placement still feels extraordinary. Why build such a complex city on a reef? using heavy volcanic stone in a place constantly negotiated by water. Some writers have emphasized the magnetic qualities of basalt and speculated that Nan Madol may have occupied an energetic location. These interpretations remain uncertain and should be held carefully, but even without them, the site carries a powerful lesson. Ancient builders repeatedly chose difficult places for meaningful work. Nan Madol is not convenient. It is deliberate. The basalt had to be quarried, moved, stacked, and maintained in an environment where water was both obstacle and ally. The city's canals gave it a floating quality, as though power itself had been separated from ordinary land. Geometry here was political, sacred, and environmental all at once. Standing in imagination among its wet stones, one senses that Nan Madol was never meant to blend into the world. It was meant to mark a threshold between worlds. Some landscapes do not announce their design from above. They reveal it slowly, stone by stone. In Brittany, France, near the village of Carnac, thousands of standing stones stretch across fields in long, patient rows. They do not form one monument, but a vast arrangement. Menhirs rise from the earth in alignments that seem to continue beyond the eye's ability to hold them. Morning mist moves between them. Sheep graze nearby. The ancient geometry remains. The purpose of the Carnac stones is still debated. They may have marked ceremonial routes, territorial memory, burial landscapes, astronomical observations, or social gatherings. Some interpretations connect them to ley lines, the idea that ancient sites align along invisible paths of terrestrial energy. Mainstream scholarship treats ley line theories with caution, but the fascination persists because the alignments themselves are real and visually powerful. To walk among the Carnac stones is to feel the difference between a monument and a field of intention. One standing stone can be symbolic. Thousands create a system. If we imagine them as an antenna array, as some speculative thinkers have done, then the landscape becomes almost technological. But perhaps technology is too narrow a word. Ancient societies may have built ways of tuning human life to land, season, ancestor, and sky without separating the practical from the sacred. The rows at Carnac do not need to break modern physics to remain mysterious. Their mystery is more human than that. They show us an effort repeated thousands of times. Stone raised, aligned, remembered, and left for a future that would forget the language. The question is not only what they did, it is what kind of world required so many markers to be understood. High in the Andes, near Lake Titicaca, there are stones that seem to belong to a system of thought we have only partly recovered. Pumapunku, part of the Tiwanaku cultural sphere in Bolivia, is famous for its precisely shaped blocks, especially the so-called H-blocks. Their clean angles, repeated forms, grooves, and interlocking possibilities have led some viewers to compare them to modular construction pieces. The impression is striking. They look less carved than manufactured. Archaeologists explain Pumapunku through the skill of Andean stoneworkers who used stone tools, abrasives, measurement, labor organization, and generations of experience to shape and place blocks with remarkable precision. This does not diminish the achievement. It makes it greater. Precision without modern industrial machinery requires time, discipline, and a culture that values exactness. Still, the site invites speculation because standardization is one of the signatures of modern technology. When we see repeated forms, we think of templates, production systems, and engineering logic. At Pumapunku, that logic seems to appear in an ancient ritual landscape, wrapped in weather and ruin. The emotional tension comes from our own assumptions. We expect the ancient world to be irregular, handmade, and approximate. But Pumapunku reminds us that human beings have always pursued order. Long before factories, there were minds capable of modular thinking. Long before steel, there was geometry disciplined by stone. If these blocks were part of a sacred platform, a ceremonial gateway, or a symbolic architecture of power, their precision was not decorative. It communicated authority. In the Andes, measurement itself may have been a form of reverence. By this point in the journey, a pattern begins to emerge, not as proof, but as a question. Giza gives us mass and alignment. Abydos gives us water, granite, and sacred geometry. Teotihuacan gives us minerals hidden beneath cosmic urban planning. Malta gives us resonance inside carved darkness. Stonehenge gives us sound contained by a circle. Nan Madol gives us basalt and water. Karnak gives us alignment across landscape. Pumapunku gives us modular precision in high mountain air. Seen separately, each site belongs to its own culture, history, and meaning. They should not be flattened into one story. Egypt is not Malta. France is not Bolivia. Micronesia is not Mexico. The danger of any global theory is that it can erase local voices in the search for a single grand design. And yet, comparison can still be useful when it is done with care. Across the ancient world, people repeatedly placed stone in relation to sky, sound, water, and geometry. They built not only to occupy space, but to transform it. A chamber became an instrument. A circle became a field of attention. A pyramid became a mountain of measurement. A city became a map of the cosmos. Perhaps the world grid theory is best understood not as a finished answer, but as a modern metaphor for an older human instinct. The instinct to believe that places have power. That Earth is not a dead surface beneath our feet, but a living pattern we can enter, mark, and honor. Modern physics has revealed that matter is vibration, fields, forces, and relationships. Ancient builders did not use those words, but they may have felt, through ritual and craft, that reality was woven. The question is how much of that feeling became architecture. Before the final site, we need to pause with the most fragile word in this story: physics. When people say ancient structures break the laws of modern physics, they usually do not mean that gravity stopped or that matter disobeyed itself. The stones did not float because history forgot to record a miracle. The earth did not suspend its rules for one civilization and deny them to another. More often, the phrase reveals a gap in understanding. A stone seems too heavy, a cut seems too precise, an alignment seems too intentional, a sound effect seems too strange. And into that gap, imagination enters. Imagination is not the enemy of truth. Many discoveries began as questions that sounded unreasonable at first. But imagination needs discipline. Otherwise, mystery becomes a mirror, and we see only what we want to believe. The deeper wonder is that ancient people accomplished so much within the laws of nature. They understood leverage, labor, rhythm, season, material, sound, and symbol. They observed the sky without telescopes, moved stone without engines, and built spaces that still alter human emotion thousands of years later. That does not make them superhuman. It makes them profoundly human. So perhaps these structures do not break modern physics. Perhaps they break modern arrogance. They remind us that intelligence does not always leave behind wires, engines, or written manuals. Sometimes it leaves a polished wall, a tuned chamber, a stone row, a mineral floor, a pyramid aligned to points of light. Sometimes it leaves evidence that is not incomplete because people were primitive, but because time is relentless, and time erases instruction before it erases form. That is why the final place matters. In India, cut into the hard stone of the Barabar Hills, the Barabar Caves wait in a silence so polished it almost feels liquid. These caves are among the earliest surviving rock-cut chambers in India, associated with the Mauryan period. Their interiors are famous for an extraordinary mirror-like polish on granite surfaces. The walls curve and gleam in low light. The chambers are simple in form, but acoustically powerful. A voice inside them can bloom, multiply, and return with an intensity that feels far larger than the room. Some visitors describe echoes that linger in strange ways. Sound seems to move along the polished stone, not as an ordinary reflection, but as an enveloping presence. It is easy to understand why such a place might become associated with meditation, altered perception, or what modern viewers sometimes call psychic frequencies. Careful language is important. We cannot prove that the caves were designed to manipulate consciousness in any modern scientific sense. But we can say that their acoustics are striking, and that ancient spiritual traditions often took sound seriously. Chant, breath, resonance, and repetition have long been used to focus the mind and reshape inner experience. The Barabar Caves bring the journey inward. After pyramids, stone circles, island cities, and geometric fields, we arrive in a nearly empty room. No vast skyline, no towering facade, only polished stone, human breath, and returning sound. And perhaps that is the most haunting possibility of all. The ancient machine, if there was one, may not have been built only to move energy through the earth. It may have been built to move attention through the human mind. The anomaly is not just in gravity, it is in perception. If these were nodes in a grid, who turned it off? Or is it still running, quietly, beneath our categories? That question remains suspended between evidence and imagination. We have traveled from Egypt's limestone plateau to Malta's underground chambers, from the avenues of Teotihuacan to the wet basalt walls of Nan Madol, from the standing stones of Karnak to the precision blocks of Pumapunku, and finally to the polished silence of the Barabar Caves. At every stop, the same pattern returned in a different language: stone, geometry, sound, alignment, memory. None of this requires us to abandon reason. In fact, the mystery becomes more powerful when reason stays with us. Ancient builders were not background figures in a primitive world. They were observers, engineers, priests, artists, organizers, and dreamers. They lived close to materials. They studied cycles, they listened to places, they built with patience that modern life rarely understands. The world grid may be a theory, a metaphor, or a question still too large for the evidence, but the structures themselves are real. They remain under sun, rain, jungle, desert wind, and the slow turning of stars. They continue to gather people around them, not because they give easy answers, but because they preserve a kind of disciplined wonder. Perhaps the past is not asking us to believe every possibility. Perhaps it is asking us to become better witnesses. And if the builders of these places disappeared into history, maybe they did not vanish entirely. Maybe they left their thoughts in stone, their measurements in silence, and their questions in the spaces where our certainty begins to soften. For more on where such builders might have gone, continue the journey with 10 subterranean cities that prove prehistoric high-tech existed. Until then, the stones remain, waiting, listening, and still measuring time.